Throughout our time period, law and order in the American West was poor. So let's look at the reasons for this. Now, there are some underlying reasons. One of the main ones was the poor quality and accessibility of official law and order. So until a place got 60,000 people, it relied on the federal government to send law enforcers. Now, the federal government provided 3 judges for each territory or place, a US Marshal who could hire deputy marshals, even other people who weren't qualified to form a posse to go and catch the criminals. But in reality, the criminals knew they were likely to get away with the crimes. This was because it took so long for these officials to get to the source of the problem, and they were relying up until the 1860s on just travelling via horseback. It just wasn't practical. Plus, the officials in place were often corrupt anyhow, so they would take bribes and they weren't trustworthy, which didn't help enforce law and order. Now, what happened because of the poor official law and order was that people took law and order into their own hands. These people were called vigilantes. Now, their form of justice was often very harsh, so lynching, which was hanging without trial, was very common. Now, once a place got 60,000 people or more, it became a state, and it could set its own laws and employ its own law and order officials. This slowly began to improve law and order, but it was a long process. So by the 1890s, things were a bit better. There were sheriffs put in place, and because the county elected them, or the state elected them, they were sometimes a bit more trustworthy, but even then the sheriffs often weren't that trustworthy. And in the 1890s, the American West, whilst less dangerous than the 1840s, was still dangerous. So let's look at some examples of the crimes committed by the people in the American West, and the chronology of the types of crimes and the types of law and order officials. So in 1848, gold was discovered in California. That led to the gold rush, which led to a whole new set of problems in regards to law and order. So new crimes became more common or more problematic. These crimes included claim jumping, which was stealing a man's land when he believed he had discovered gold on it. Racial crimes to do with the Chinese immigrants who came in search of gold. Because gold settlements lacked communities, lacked women, children. Often there was a lot of testosterone, young men carrying guns, and that led to problems. There was bitterness and frustration from men who didn't find gold, and they turned to anger. There was gambling, drink, saloons, prostitutions. All of that meant that the new settlements created in the 1840s and 50s around gold were rife with crime. In 1865, the Civil War ended, and this also created more law and order problems. So the Confederate soldiers, so they're the Southern soldiers who had lost in the Civil War, were often bitter about their loss, and they were used to being quite violent in the war, and they continued this violence after the war. So let's look at some examples of ex-Civil War soldiers who turned to crime. One example was the Reno Gang. Now, the Reno Gang terrorised communities and were famous for robbing trains. One train they robbed had a safe on it with $16,000 in that safe. Now, the owner of that safe actually was so lacked so much faith in official law and order, they hired private law and order officials called the Pinkerton Detective Agency to catch the Reno gang. Now, the Pinkerton Detective Agency caught one member of the gang, and that member gave the names of the other members. So they went to hunt down the gang, but actually members of the community kind of got there first, and they killed the other members of the gang in 1868. So this is a good example of showing not only a cause of crime and the types of crime, which was train robbery and ex-Civil War soldiers, but also how people were forced to turn to private law and order officials or employees, and the problems those private law and order people ran into when vigilantes took it into their own hands to kill the Reno gang. Another example of an ex-Civil War soldier who turned to crime was the James Younger gang. Now, the James Younger gang stole from stagecoaches and also banks, and they too were caught by vigilantes. The townspeople in 1876 got hold of the James Younger gang and also killed them. So once again, you have vigilante rough justice. Now, in some senses, new law and order problems were created in 1867. Now, that was because you had the first cow town. Now, the first cow town was Abilene, and in cow towns, the cowboys would come to these towns at the end of the long drive. They'll be celebrating the drive being over. They would have been paid, so they'll spend their money getting drunk in saloons, in brothels with prostitutes, and they all had guns. They were quite young, and you had lots of violence and law and order problems. So let's look at how one town, Abilene, dealt with the problems caused by cowboys. Well, they hired Wild Bill Hickok as their marshal. Now, Wild Bill had a reputation. He had a colourful past, and because of that, the cowboys did listen to him and respect him. But in many ways, he was a criminal himself. He lived with a succession of prostitutes. He was quite violent, and he killed his own deputy. Only a year after he was hired, the town fired him. So that didn't really work. And Wild Bill Hickok is an example of a law official who committed crimes themselves. Remember, he killed his deputy. They also, though, closed the brothels permanently and introduced closing times to saloons. That was more effective in helping the cow towns become safer, and they did that in 1870. And finally, perhaps most importantly, they got to a point where they just banned cowboys from Abilene. So the cowboys could drop off their cows, but then they had to leave. So this is an example of how Abilene tried to deal with their own law and order problems. Law and order problems, while slowly improving, were still an issue in the 1870s and 1880s. This was because of the conflict between homesteaders and local businessmen and townspeople versus the cattlemen and the cattle barons and their cowboys, who were often much richer and had control over land. They would fall out over arguments to do with fence cutting and access to water sources and sometimes cattle rustling. So let's look at some examples of such conflict. So you had the Lincoln County War of 1878, which involved Billy the Kid, who was a member of the gang called the Regulators. Now, they fought against the cattle barons in the town, and Billy the Kid became notorious because he evaded justice after killing 3 of the cattle barons. He was also seen as a bit of a victim of the situation because he was the only one who ended up being caught and found guilty, and eventually he was shot. Whereas there were lots of people involved in the Lincoln County War, but they didn't get arrested and punished in the same way. Another example of a range war, so a range war is between the cowboys and cattle barons and homesteaders and local townspeople, was the Tombstone County War of 1881. Now this involved Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp is an example of a corrupt law enforcer. The local businesses employed Wyatt Earp to try to help them control the cattle barons. Wyatt Earp already had a criminal past, and he made the situation and tension between the local businessmen and the cattle barons even worse. So in 1881, he was involved in a gunfight at the OK Corral, where he killed 3 people. 2 of them were part of the McClancy family, and 1 was a Clanton. They were cattle barons, and were just 3 of a number of people killed in this shootout, where 60 shots were fired. Now after this, the cattle barons sought retribution, and they killed Wyatt Earp's brother. But Wyatt went hunting the cattle barons down, took law and order completely into his own hands, and killed those people he personally held responsible for the killing of his brother. Whether they were guilty or not, we will never know, because they never went to court or through a trial, because he took law and order totally into his own hands. Another example of a range war was the Johnson County War of 1892. Now this was between the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, who were controlled by the cattle barons, and local homesteaders. Now the cattle barons owned a lot of land, but they were going through a very rough time because of the decline in the cattle industry. Now they were frustrated, and they started accusing homesteaders of committing cattle rustling. They accused 2 people, Jim Averill and Ella Watson, and they took law and order into their own hands and hung them. They then decided they were going to stop this cattle rustling altogether, and they hired 22 gunmen to kill anyone they suspected of cattle rustling, and they promised dollars to any gunmen that killed one of the cattle rustlers. Now the cattle barons could afford this because they were very, very rich. So the gunmen all joined together trying to hunt down these cattle rustlers, and they held them up in a building. Now Nate Champion, one of the local homesteaders, bravely managed to fight them off all day until he was eventually shot. But the situation was so bad that the US Army came to rescue the homesteaders, and the US Army arrested the cattle barons. But the case never actually came to fruition. It never reached its end, because the cattle barons were able to hire really expensive lawyers who kept delaying the case until Johnson County ran out of money and just dropped the case. Now this showed how law and order was still very ineffective, but it also frustrated local people, and people got fed up of the cattle barons' power, and the kind of public opinion turned against the cattle barons a little bit. But it shows how law and order was a problem all the way from the 1840s to the 1890s. However, it did get better as places got settled and they started to employ people that were less corrupt and more trustworthy.